Good evening, everyone watching on YouTube, and welcome to Princeton Review's SAT Night Live. My name is Ken Brenner, and we're focusing on, well, the SAT tonight. And we sort of figured that since some of you are maybe in the midst of starting your preparations for the summer SAT or whichever SAT you are going to work on, we would kind of tackle one of the major issues that often shows up on this exam, and that is this idea of time management, right? With 3 hours to do 154 questions, it's so easy for any of the sections to completely get away from us. One moment you think that you're doing great, you're moving, you're keeping an eye on the clock, and the next moment they're giving the 5-minute warning, and you look at the 10 or 15 problems that you still have blank. And so what we want to do tonight is kind of talk about the overall strategies that help with our time when we're confronted with difficult tasks or when we're just not sure what to prioritize as we're trying to earn the highest possible score. And one of the frustrating things is when we run across a math concept or a reading or a writing concept with which we're not that familiar. Could we possibly save time when we have these 4 different options and we're not exactly sure which way to go? Well, let's take something that you might not be familiar with. Our first example here, right, says the capital of Qatar is. Well, maybe you haven't looked at your globe that recently and you're not sure which city is the capital of Qatar. However, we do know that we have 4 answers because this is a multiple choice test. And so it might not always be the most time efficient to look for the one answer that's right, but it might be more efficient to look at what's wrong. As you look at these different options, you'll notice that you might be a little familiar with some of these cities. And so which one of these answers is the capital of Qatar definitely not? Well, we're looking at A, Paris, and we're looking at C, Tokyo. And now let's look at what's happened in this case. All of a sudden, our odds have improved to 50-50 on a question we maybe weren't too sure about. Well, what does that mean for us? That means that we could pretty effectively take a guess on this question and simply move on. And our odds of getting this question right have improved. Most importantly, we haven't burned a lot of our clock getting higher odds of getting this answer correct. Now, this question won't actually be on the exam, but let's move on to something that looks like a little bit more of an SAT style question. So here we have a reading question. As used in line 18, collusion most nearly means. Again, you might not be very familiar with collusion and with this vocab and context style question, but how can I make progress on it using POE, the process of elimination, from our previous problem? Well, if I look at my problem carefully and see that they're asking about collusion, when I see my 4 answer choices, I see that one of them would match the word collision just fine, but doesn't match collusion at all. And that would be B, impact. I know that impact is collision, and it's probably not collusion. And so I get rid of an answer that might just be there to trap someone who is going too fast and not being careful enough with their questions. Then when I go into the sentence in which collusion appears, right, as you can kind of see, if the Kremlin were to acknowledge the existence of this protocol, they reasoned, it would be admitting that the Baltic states had no legal marriage with Moscow, but that these nations were forcibly abducted with the collusion of the world's most heinous fascist regime. So if collusion is my word, and my context clue says forcibly abducted, well, abducted is taking somebody, right? Kidnapping them, getting control over them. We probably then wouldn't be talking about a separation. Now, I would need to go a little bit further to know that my answer here is conspiracy, but I have a couple of traps laid for me based off a misreading of the question or my context clues that's going to be able to help me eliminate some answers. So POE, process of elimination, is one of the ways in which we can reestablish some control of the test. And even if we're uncertain about a problem, we could eliminate flawed answer choices, improving our accuracy, but taking less time than it would take if we were to kind of just stare at the problem and try to figure this out on our own. And This kind of blends into what we're talking about tonight, the idea of managing our time. So if we move over to the arena of math, take a look at this problem. This problem says, right, if the h of x is 3x cubed plus 18x squared plus 15x, and the j of x is x squared plus 6x plus 5, then which of the following functions is divisible by 3x plus 1? Our high school brains tell us, let's get to work. It's time to jump into the answers, start combining functions, and start doing long division or binomial long division or synthetic division. Before I go down that road, and if you're not sure what I just said, we want to keep a note of how complicated this problem looks like it's going to be. And not only does the problem look complicated, but look at where it falls in the exam. This is question 27, which is 27 out of 30 multiple choice that appear in section 4, the calculator section. As you might have noticed if you've done SAT prep already, the questions in math get harder as they go. So being so close to the end of the multiple choice, we are at the toughest problems. And difficult often means time consuming. We want to recognize that after this problem, there's a 28, a 29, and a 30 in the multiple choice. But there's also a 31 through 38 of the grid-in problems. And those typically reset in difficulty, with 31 or 32 being a little bit easier, and then kind of spiking back up in difficulty again. And this is for that scenario that I kind of described in the beginning. You feel like you're moving along, but all of a sudden we lose 7, 8, 9 minutes on one problem. And so what might be more effective is to develop a concept that we like to call personal order of difficulty, which shortens to POOD. POOD is kind of our second big idea. And it's this concept of understanding which questions are easier for me to do and harder for me to do. And harder does not always mean longer, does not always mean the math is hard, but rather it could mean the problem is simply going to take a while. And so before I devote my 7, 8, 9, or 10 minutes to this problem, I might see 28, 29, 30, or 31 through 38 on the grid-ins. I might look at those first and see how many of them are easier for me to do before I spend time and energy on the hardest problems. So what would I do with this question? What if I don't make it back to it? And what if I'm not sure? Well, then we have another concept that we call LOTD, or letter of the day. If this concept I decide falls outside of my personal order of difficulty, it's not worth doing right now, then what I might do is I might, before the test, choose a random letter. I'm going to say B of the 4 letters, and I'm simply going to go ahead and circle it. And I might want to make a note to myself that I'll come back to this problem if I can, but the whole point is to get a response in case I don't make it back to the problem, and move on to questions that might be easier within my personal order of difficulty. This can also happen on the writing and language section. Take a look at question number 11. It says, number 11, the best placement for paragraph 5 would be. Also take note that question 11 asks about the previous passage as a whole. So the first time we see this problem, we say, well, maybe my personal order of difficulty alarm is going off. And I'm saying, wait a minute, this problem is about the entire passage. That means I need to have read and understood the passage pretty well to know where paragraph 5 should go. Well, there are 11 questions on every single grammar passage, every single writing and language passage. I might say to myself, you know, there's those other 10 problems that would have been part of this set. Are any of those easier for me? Are any of those within my personal order of difficulty? It makes no sense to spend a lot of time on this number 11 right now because every single question is just worth 1 point. So before we devote our time to this harder problem, we're going to go back, we're going to look at every other simpler task, and I'll show you an example of that a little bit later in our night. We're going to try to get those points first. And again, I might put in my letter of the day. This type of thing is going to be essential for our third and maybe the most important of these 3 categories, which we call pacing. Pacing in a phrase is efficient time management, and it kind of incorporates personal order of difficulty and uses that to manage your clock well. The idea is that we want to slow down on the questions that our personal order of difficulty says are easier and consider bypassing at first the problems we consider harder. Take a look at this set of 4 writing and language questions in case you wanted even more of that to look at. Question number 3 looks like it's going to be time consuming. Which of the following true statements contains information most in keeping with the main idea of this passage? Well, geez, I'm not sure. It's going to take me a moment to get the main idea of the whole passage, right? So what I do with pacing is I say, let me skip this problem. Let me come back to it. Let me say that for now it's outside of my personal order of difficulty, and let me preserve my clock by moving on to the next problem. Question 4 has the same issue. Which of the following best concludes this paragraph by reinforcing ideas presented in this sentence and the preceding one? I'm going to need to read 2 sentences and understand their context to get this question right. It's going to take time. Or maybe it's a type of problem I'm not very comfortable with. And so if I bypass both of these problems using good pacing, recognizing that they're outside of my POOD, I get to question 5. And I realize something, that question 5 and 6 are a lot more simple than their counterparts number 3 and 4. And despite the fact the College Board put them in this order, maybe I am better off doing them outside of outside of the order of the test. Indeed, in my own personal order of difficulty, my own POOD. And so that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to come back to 3 and 4, and I'm going to jump right into question 5. And I see here that question 5 is a pretty simple verbs question, and I don't want to go crazy with all of the different verb rules tonight, but I do see that if I look at the sentence, the meaning of these 4 words were nowhere near more ambiguous than in prisons. I see that the phrase, the meaning, is singular. Well, that means I want a singular verb to go along with my singular subject. Well, A and B, were and have, are plural. And actually, we're not even done because so is are. To recap from the beginning of the night, we call this the process of elimination. And so we start to see how all of these things come together. What's the answer to the problem? D, the only singular verb. It's my personal order of difficulty that told me that numbers 3 and 4 were time consuming, but it's my personal order of difficulty as well that tells me that 5 is simpler. In terms of pacing, I slow down and I eliminate the 3 answers that don't match my subject, and I'm left with the 1 answer that's right. And all of these things speak to our management. Now I've built some momentum on an easy problem, and I'm feeling much better about myself on number 6. Everyone within these walls have been convicted of a crime and now paying their debt to society. Okay, but how could a government ensure that the place would deliver the reform in a reformatory or the penitence in a penitentiary? Got you. Well, I see now with these pronouns, right? Because I can take the time to slow down, because I skipped those harder questions before, that we're talking about everyone are the people who kind of possess the debt. And when I say everyone, I'm talking about every one person. That's singular. I'm going to eliminate my pronouns here that are plural, like A, they are, and B, their. And then I have the word there, which can deal with location. It's not even usually a pronoun, and so that's not going to work in this case. What's my singular pronoun? What's my answer that's left? Well, it's just going to be D, his or her. If you try to rush past these easier problems because you're trying to do all 11 questions in every section every time, you might not be able to think as critically about the answers, and you might get one of these more straightforward problems wrong. And so it's really important to think about how all these concepts work together. We can apply the same type of thing to reading. I'm sorry. Apologies. I'm getting ahead of myself because there's just so many interesting things to talk about. We can apply these same things to those later questions. Now that I'm looking at number 3 and number 4, the questions that I had skipped before in my personal order of difficulty, things change, don't they? I have the confidence that the number 5 and the number 6 are correct. I was careful. I took a relatively small amount of time to make sure that I got those answers. I built some momentum. I preserved my clock. Now it would make sense to come back to these more difficult question tasks, number 3 and number 4. And so if I look at number 3, my sentence is, fortunately, her dad knew someone from high school, a friend named Ellen, who had then gone on to study at Duke University. My question says, which of the following true statements contains information most in keeping with the main idea of this passage? So I want the answer that's most in keeping with the main idea. Well, I can't possibly know that if I don't read more, but it's so much better to do this reading knowing that I've already have a bunch of questions from before answered. So it was a thankless job, and although the department building itself covered almost 100 acres in New York City, there was an entire island devoted to it, no one paid the Department of Corrections much mind. Most people never came near a jail cell, so it's easy for them to dismiss inmates as totally removed from society. So what's the main idea of this passage? Well, it seems to be that the Department of Corrections doesn't get paid much mind, despite how big the building is, and that people don't come near a jail cell. So it's all about this concept of the Department of Corrections and how it really doesn't it's about the Department of Corrections and what people think of it. Well, then when I apply the concept of process of elimination, choice A, who had gone on to study at Duke University. Well, nothing about Duke University is in keeping with the main idea. So process of elimination says A is gone. B, who had gone on to law school and now worked at the County Department of Corrections. Well, that's helpful, right? Because this friend, it doesn't matter if we know his or her name or not, but if they're connected with the Department of Corrections, that's in keeping with the focus of the rest of my paragraph. C, with whom he had not spoken in 25 years, though with whom he felt very close, I can take the time to apply process of elimination. That's not consistent with the main idea of the passage. And finally, delete the underlined portion. If I remove that, her dad knew someone from high school, a friend, it was a thankless job would be next. I don't know what the friend's connection to the story is. I can carefully and confidently eliminate these answers and choose B. But to repeat such an important idea, I cannot do that if I'm rushing. And I can't do that if I'm rushing to try to get every problem. But I certainly can do it with the confidence that my easy points, my straightforward points, are already out of the way. So in number 4, most people never come near a jail cell, so it's easy for them to dismiss inmates as totally removed from society. Which of these best concludes this paragraph by reinforcing ideas presented in this sentence and the previous one? One thing at a time, working confidently and carefully. The previous sentence, it was a thankless job, and though the department building itself covered almost 100 acres, no one paid the Department of Corrections much mind. Okay, so no one's paying much attention to the Department of Corrections. Most people never come near a jail cell. So I have two concepts that were brought up in the sentence before and in this sentence itself. The idea that no one pays the department much mind, and the idea that people never come near jail cells. So I run through my answers. It's easy for them to dismiss inmates as totally removed from society. You know, we're not sure about this one because we haven't really talked about inmates, but we have talked about jail cells, and we have talked about people not paying much attention, right? And so this answer we might leave alone. B, people often know literally nothing about prison life, though they are endlessly fascinated. Well, say for a moment we said, know nothing about prison life matches, so we keep this answer. Movie studios are famous for their sordid but often wrong depictions of prison life. Our focus here, though, wasn't on movie studios. It was about how people don't really seem to pay attention to the Department of Corrections or know what goes on inside. Incarceration rates in the United States are some of the highest in the world, but these two sentences weren't talking about how high incarceration rates are. So how important is process of elimination on the SAT? A and B might both have sound good, But this phrase is, though they are endlessly fascinated. Nothing here suggests that people are fascinated. As a matter of fact, the job is thankless. No one paid the Department of Corrections much mind, and most people never come near a jail cell. None of that is consistent with people being fascinated. And so, even when I'm down to 2, we find that process of elimination is an essential skill, and we're only able to carefully apply it when we do problems in the right order, our own personal order. The same could be said for the reading passages, right? In that the questions are arranged in an order of College Board's choosing, usually chronologically, but the easy, straightforward, we'll call them tasks, are intermingled with the general, more time-consuming ones. Take a look at this sample of questions. Number 12, the first problem here, wants to know the primary purpose of passage 1. Well, unless I want to, just like with writing language, read the entire passage, it's going to be very time-consuming to know what the primary purpose of passage 1 is. Similarly, which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? Well, the previous question was question 12, a question that we already chose not to answer. And so, in that spirit, both of these are time-consuming, and they are outside of my personal order of difficulty, at least for now. And so what I choose to do, pacing-wise, is spend no time on them at first. And instead, I jump to this next problem, question 14. I like that this problem uses direct lines, and it's going to be about a smaller chunk of the passage. It might not be easier, but it will be more straightforward. And so by focusing on question 14 first, I have a much higher chance that I'm going to be able to use my time wisely, get this problem right, and slowly work my way up to the more general time-consuming problems. So this one says, as is used in lines 21, maintained most nearly means. Well, now that I can take the time, I can go into the passage and I can find the sentence that is part of question 14. And I can take the word maintained in the sentence and I can kind of pay attention to it. In both previous and future videos, we'll go more in depth on the reading strategies themselves. But of course, such labor is cheap, and it is desirable, if possible, to employ those who must be maintained at the cost of the parish. But in no case should they be left with the sole charge and responsibility of 6 wards, as they continuously are at present without any other control than the occasional visit of the matron, bestowed at the utmost once a day, in some case only once a week. The language here might be tricky, but if I'm saying to myself this is one of the points I want to earn, I can take the time to work this problem out, right? And so what I might say to myself is, well, the labor is cheap and it's desirable to employ those who must be something maintained at the cost of the parish. Well, if I take a look, we're talking here about employment, right? And so while normal maintenance might be to heal or fix people, I can apply some process of elimination here. And I could say, you know what? These are regular definitions, perhaps, of maintenance that don't really fit my context. And so if I'm talking about things being cheap and being able to employ these people who kind of have to be there, although they certainly can't be left alone, what is most in line with all of this? Well, very likely something like provided for. And so I'm using process of elimination to eliminate the answers that are likely to be traps and that don't fit the context. And working confidently and carefully, I'm able to work my way to a right answer. Similarly, our next problem, number 15, one of the last problems we'll get to tonight, says the phrase in lines 34 to 35, we could hardly hope most directly suggests that. Okay, so if I were to look at those lines, and usually we would read more lines than this, I would say something like, that such a person who would always be all we could desire for so important a post, we could hardly hope. from what we know of the paid nurses in hospitals. But at any rate, there would be a better chance of efficiency and character than in the present plan. It might be tough if I'm moving too quickly to get a handle on what's going on here. But the idea is that such a person would always be all we could desire. We could hardly hope. Well, that means the author doesn't think we really are going to get or really should hope for the person being everything. But at any rate, there'd be a better chance of efficiency. This is telling me that while this person might not be perfect, we're probably not getting the perfect person, it would be a step forward. And so we go to these options, right? A, an ideal candidate should be found for a position. Well, possibly, right? The author doesn't necessarily say. The author says that we could hardly hope that we're going to get everything we want in the person, but maybe. People who go to hospitals should be critical of nurses. No, right? He's not saying that we should critique nurses. Allowances should be made since no person is perfect. Here's the thing. And allowances should be made since no person is perfect. He's saying, yeah, no person's perfect, but it would be an improvement. So this wasn't his main point. An improvement is still likely to have some flaws. If they're asking what's the point of phrase, we could hardly hope, he's admitting that we're not going to have that perfect person. So, an ideal candidate should be found for a position, but the author is admitting that that we probably shouldn't hope for an ideal candidate, as promising as that seemed at first. He doesn't say we're going to get that person. And therefore, what captures what we underline the best? The fact that he thinks this is an improvement, and he admits that the person's not going to have everything we desire, but it would be better, and so our answer here would be D. And then where we're left with after doing these problems are these general questions. And the whole idea here is twofold, putting all of our components together. Personal order of difficulty said these problems were time consuming. So pacing said we should move on from them very quickly and come back to them. Now, when we go back and we look at these problems again, a decision would have to be made. Is there enough time on my clock to do numbers 12 and 13? Or do I look back at the rest of the reading passage and say the number that the other 6 or 7 or 8 points I earned here would probably improve my score? And so sometimes when you come back around to stuff you skipped previously, you may say to yourself, you know what? It's more worth it for me to move on to the next passage and get the next 7 or 8 problems of that next passage, rather than continuing to burn my clock on maybe the longest or toughest problems of this passage. And so, whether we work these out, or if we decide that we're not working these out, I go back to something we mentioned earlier, which was the idea of letter of the day. And here's what I would say, what I would want to close with. If I decided I was running low on time and I wanted to make sure that I kept my clock up, I'm going to want to use the same letter of the day for each of these areas. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that my letter of the day was D. And I had chosen D on both of these problems. Well, if I look at the answers that wound up being selected, right? First of all, letter of the day works out really well here because these are both the right answers. But the idea being that it's more to my benefit to get a letter of the day and keep it consistent and to be able to move on to my next passage than necessarily it would be to labor over these and cause 4, 5, 6, 7 minutes, right? So also, even if only one of these had been D, I'm still earning a point from a question that I didn't even decide I was going to spend my time on. So, how could we put this in an effective summary? Knowing the concepts, pacing, personal order of difficulty, POE, and letter of the day together are your most effective weapons at time management. Personal order of the day is oh my gosh, we're just combining things. Personal order of difficulty is this idea that you decide what's easy and what's hard. Pacing says you devote your time to the easier questions, making sure you earn those points. You save the harder questions in your POOD for later. Then, if later on you decide that they're still not worth your time, you can fill in your letter of the day so that you move on and get to other tasks that you can more easily accomplish. And your ally through all of this is process of elimination. That no matter the difficulty of the problem, your best weapon is to eliminate the flawed answers in every single problem that you see. And so with these concepts, we might not be an expert on geography and the capital city of Qatar, but we can become an expert and master the SAT. My name is Ken Brenner. Thank you so much for sticking with the Princeton Review on YouTube for SAT Night Live. And please be back with us next week for another one of these segments at 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your evening.